The one thing that the youth spoke to us about was the difficulty they had in navigating the system. I can't navigate the system, and this is what I do for a living, right? I've mapped this stuff out on boards and tried to figure out who's connected to who and whatnot. When you start talking about, federal and then provincial health, structures, when you start talking about municipal response programs, when you talk about public and private agencies and their interaction or lack of interaction, therefore, you run into a real difficulty in mapping out the process. And the youth really are aware of what's going on. They know when they're in private and when they're in public systems. They know that they can go to faith-based institutions and get better care for a specific need at this moment in time, and then they know when to jump back into the provincial healthcare system. They're very wise, they're very shrewd in terms of how they deal, but at the same time, a lot of that's got to do with the fact that they just don't know the system. And oftentimes they work with people that, albeit are incredibly informed with what they do, they oftentimes have difficulty in directing people to the appropriate responses and strategies. Aboriginal programming, I didn't think it was going to be an issue here insofar as the reserve communities are quite a distance away from Red Deer when you compare it to Calgary, when you compare it to Lethbridge. But nevertheless, what we found is that there's a heightened attention to these issues. We did speak with a couple of First Nations youth who suggested that in addition to being invisible as a youth, they're doubly invisible as First Nations homeless youth at this moment in time. So the notion of invisibility and not fitting in anywhere, and then on top of it all, not really seeing culturally sensitive programming, that was a real difficulty, and they tend to be the most mobile of the youth at this moment in time. There's a lot of mobility, there's no doubt, a lot of folks searching for work, so they go up to Edmonton, they'll head down to Calgary, but they see Red Deer as their home and they gravitate back here. First Nations, they just go when they don't find that there's a cultural acceptance of who they are, and they'll seek it out elsewhere, but they don't see Red Deer as home, even if they happen to have been born here or they reside in one of the orbiting communities. One of the issues, streamlined definition of youth. What's a youth? What are the age brackets here? Throw me some numbers. Up to 30? Under 25? All right. What's the provincial? 13 to 25? 13 to 24. I've heard anything from 12 to 46 because I still am a child on so many levels. So we got to streamline that and come up with something that is appropriate. But I also think within, and Steve had a slide there, there's kind of a 12 to 18, 18 to 22, 22 to 25. There's specific needs within each of those age brackets that need to be dealt with and need to be responded to accordingly. Youth-family relationships are in most cases reconcilable, right? There's a chapter in the book there. Who's it by? Daphne. Oh, your wife. We know each other real well. And it's a fantastic piece on the reconcilability of those relationships. And the fact of the matter is, once the youth are into our system, right, they fall outside the family model, we find that instantly it's viewed as was identified, a problem, right? And we try and distance ourselves from those problems. Her numbers demonstrated that, anywhere from 33 to 66% of the youth can be put back into the nuclear family with a little bit of time, effort, and some effective programming directed specifically at that issue. Outreach services, the pimps and stuff, that made me laugh, right? But yeah, they do have better outreach at this point in time. It's funding, right? I don't think that we can beat ourselves up over the fact that there's a provincial budget and we can allocate only a certain amount of the tax base to specific issues, right? And that happens to be one of the issues that falls by the wayside. It's outreach. More housing units. The youth, in one case, they came up with kind of a boys' town model, which is very similar to the Calgary model in terms of, give us a place to live where we can learn the skills that we need to live on our own, where we can affect some sort of a family structure where we don't have to worry about ourselves and our health, where there's kind of an overseer who can guide us in the directions that we need to go and ultimately get us off the street. And that all the report that I'm going to produce will ultimately be circulated to whoever wants to read it. We'll put an executive summary together that's very quick to get through, but ultimately all of these ideas are going to be presented in there. The youth felt that they were stereotyped, all of them, everywhere, in Lethbridge, Red Deer, Medicine Hat. They felt that they weren't respected when they went in. They also had some really interesting things in terms of their lifestyle is on a different clock right? Just something simple. We work 8 to 5, 9 to 5. Folks outreach, maybe a little bit more 3 to 11, 3 to 1. Shelter folks, obviously, we're going to go well into the morning. But for the most part, most of our services are geared to a 9 to 5 clock. And most of the youth, they map their world temporally in a different way. And they really found it difficult to align what they needed to do in their lives, which was go to school, continue with their jobs so that they can pay for their apartment and still get to the people that they need to get to in order to keep their programs active. Best practices, this one's ongoing. I don't think it needs to be said, so I said it anyhow. Youth skills development. How do you go out and shop? How do you procure a bank card? How do you go and get that lease? How do you get a recommendation? How do you? All of the things that we take for granted in terms of growing up 13 till 18, 19. Even today, my dad still sends me $1,000 for Christmas, you know what I mean? I keep telling him to donate it to the food bank, so I just donate it to the food bank in his name, right? But he still does that stuff. He's 73 years old at this stage, and he still thinks that me, as 45 years old, I still need that assistance. It's great. It makes you feel wanted. It's a really comforting thing. But, when I was 12 through 18, the skills that I developed are skills that the youth just have no knowledge of. As an example, when they say, I got to go out and get a job, I want to have a career, I'm like, well, what sort of career do you want? I need a job, right? They've adopted the lexicon. I need a job. I need to go to school, but they don't know why, and more importantly, they don't know how it's going to happen with the lifestyle that they're living at this moment in time. And really what it does is it leads to skills equals hope on so many levels. And there was a great keynote speaker back in October in Ottawa at the Canadian Lion Stand Homeless Conference, where that was the essence of the message, hope, right? And if these kids lose hope, and it could be at 13, it could be at 25, you're really running the risk of now generating the next generation of ongoing, visible, and chronic homeless individuals. Internal agency protocols in the system itself, releasing incarcerated youth into homelessness, that became a big issue. What I found, and again, I don't mean this to be critical, but what we found, Calvin and myself, is that there's this very neoliberal sort of thing to how people are engaging in operations at this point. And all neoliberalism is just an individual perspective on life and how you should pick yourself up by your bootstraps even if you don't have boots and make it work, right? And what we found is that there was a lot of reliance on the youth to either act out and therefore be jettisoned from programs, or there was reliance on youth to not show up to programs as a method of operations, right? So we anticipate if we get 10 new youth this week, 3 or 4 of them are likely going to act outside the rules that we have within our agency, knowing that at the end of the week we're only going to have 6 there. It's very problematic, and it's really taking our duty of care responsibility and kind of shirking it to a degree. Again, funding, not pointing fingers, but it is an issue that has to be considered. And then ultimately, the one thing that we've talked about in some telephone calls and teleconferences and so on is that there's always going to be that group that has behavioral difficulties to a degree that's not going to allow them to integrate, assimilate themselves into the system. And it seems that that is the sort of program right now and housing edifice that's missing here in Red Deer. It's missing in most places, don't get me wrong, but that seems to be the one thing that is leading youth to not being brought into the shelter at night. It's leading to a lot of rough sleeping and so on and so forth. So once again, these, I think that's the last one, these are just some of the ideas that have popped up. These come from the stakeholder interviews, and I'm just going to show you this slide. It's tough to see, but really what we do with all this stuff is scrutinize it to death. It's not simply, I've read the transcripts and I come up with my best anecdotal observations or listen to the interviews. I do both. I listen to the interviews, I go through all the transcripts, but ultimately what we do is we put it through a program called In Vivo, which allows us to go through all the discourse and get a sense of what's there and what isn't. Like Steve was saying, back in the 50s and the 60s when he was growing up, 30% of youth, that was calculated on abacus. No, today we utilize the leading technology to try and come up with these ideas. And as you can see, if you can, it's really tough, but frontline workers, they talked to us about their processes. They talked about the importance of skills preparation for the youth. So there's an identification that this stuff needs to be affected. They also talked about system inefficiency. Those were the top 3 issues that popped up in our dialogues. And even though I've only got 7 of these things coded at this point, like I said, the other 8 are telling me the exact same thing. When we jump over and take a look at the youth, their big issue is the stress that's involved. They know that they are stressed at this point in time, physically, emotionally. They also realize that they are being traumatized on a regular basis. They can't articulate what trauma means, but when they tell us, they know that going downtown at night is just wrought with danger. Yet the next day they have to come downtown to access the services, and they really are having a difficulty disconnecting what downtown means from the danger, from the help that can be provided. So what we're doing is we're starting to really delve deep into the psyche of both stakeholders, frontline folks, and ultimately the youth to get a sense. And really, when we start to compare, they're both saying the same thing, right? We just need improved services that are age relevant at this moment in time. We've got to develop skills preparation programs that will aid the youth lacking parental influence at this point to guide them through the process. And then I just threw those up compared. I thought there'd be a really big screen here, but no, there's not. If anybody's interested in this stuff, all you got to do is touch base, give me an email. I can send it off to you. But these are the top 30 codes in each case, and when we take a look at the youth side on the left, all it's going to do is talk about, look, we're seeking employment, but we're also seeking our education. Really important. They're having trouble reconciling both of those needs at this moment in time. Then on top of it all, they've got to, keep up a social system. They've got to. The pressures on them are manifold. On the other side, like I said, there's recognition of systems inefficiency, a need for a more systemic approach to integrating all of the ideas and the data at this moment in time to develop a more responsive program. Now, with that in mind, this is where we have fun and we talk pie in the sky, but ultimately, as I was taking a look at all of these things, this is what popped up, and this is kind of an amalgam of a variety of different programs and different processes that are unfolding in Canada, the UK, Australia at this point in time, and it's something that all of the data, all of the interviews speaks to at this moment in time. The need for a central registry of some kind, a non-FOIP, barriered, obstructed process or system that allows for people to access data. And the reason that we're presenting that is because the 16 intakes are killing the kids, and they're also killing the system, right? Because you have to go and talk to the same youth 3 times over a 4-month period and do an intake every time, right? So if we could get FOIP out of the way, and I find FOIP to be, of all the programs in each province, it's perhaps the most obstructive that I've ever seen in Canada at this point in time. If we can create a central registry so that somebody can pull a file before even introducing themselves to the youth or reintroducing themselves, it's a personalizing system. They feel like they haven't been forgotten and they're more than a number. But on top of that, it allows us to do a couple of things. We can start to measure the centralizing communication function. Right? We can get a sense of how information is being utilized, how it's being shared, and how it's informing in a positive way and how it's devolving the system at this point in time. If we can track how the information is being utilized, then we can start to track system efficiency at that stage of the game. Agency interaction, it gives us a sense, who gets along and who doesn't. I can tell in the transcripts that y'all don't get along. Right? I heard, and Steve said it, you're not all special, but you all think you are. And what happens is we see one group saying, oh, those guys over there, they're doing that, and they're doing that, and they're doing that. We're brilliant. And then we go talk to that group, and they go, you talk to him? He's an idiot. So, I'm paraphrasing, and I'm bringing it down to its bare essence, but those are the sorts of dialogues that we saw. I know that everybody sits at common tables and committees and stuff like that, but realistically, deep down, you guys are really facing some uphill battles in terms of not only interaction and collegiality, but trust issues as well. And when we compound that with funding competition, it's a really difficult issue to overcome. But again, it's something that was identified. So if we can talk about agency interaction, talk about which agencies are perhaps a little bit more obstructive compared to those that are more willing to network and interact with one another, then we can start to identify what's working and what isn't. Youth interface with the system. How are they interfacing with the system? Private, public, denominational. When we start talking about the system, it's also how are they interacting, school, their work environment, right? The whole system itself is something that we can track at that moment in time and get a feeling for what's working and what isn't. Knowledge of youth needs. This was something that the youth brought up every time. You just don't know what we need and what we want. You guys have a template, you simply affect it according to a top-down funding process, and at the end of the day, whether we fit in or we don't, either way, it's not representing exactly what we need at this moment in time. And again, we found that that was kind of a common issue in Lethbridge and Medicine Hat as well. Right? The youth are saying, you don't know what we need, you don't know what we want, and ultimately service providers are going, well, we've only got a funding envelope that's this big, and we cannot adapt ourselves to the minutiae, those minute needs that these kids identify as most important. But if the programs don't reflect or resonate with them, their needs at this moment in time, they're not going to access them, and they're not going to have a good time in the system. Hence, their movement in and out on a regular basis. And then ultimately, how do these needs foster programming? Right? That's the big question. So the idea here, and again, it's pie in the sky, it's one of those utopian sort of things, but ultimately, if we could develop something like this, ostensibly, it would become a bottom-up information feed for programming, as opposed to a top-down funding feed that dictates programming, right? There's a big difference there. And again, I'm not blaming feds, I'm not blaming provincial officials, that's just the way the system is at this moment in time. But the bottom-up allows the integration in a more organic and responsive fashion of youth needs that at that moment in time can be responded to. And ultimately what it does is it reflects current reality as opposed to utilizing outdated data, which is only 3 months old, right? You've seen the fluidity of the community, right? Data, like this report in 3 months is going to be outdated, right? So how do we replicate what it's taken me and my research team 6 or 7 months to do on a bi-weekly or a monthly basis so that we have constantly updated data that is speaking to those issues? And then ultimately what we wanted to do is simply be self-generating, right? Not something that we have to, press start every 6 months or whatever. It just becomes a database and a tracking system that allows us to follow not only the youth themselves, but follow our own performance. Now, I had an opportunity many, many years ago to work within the Casada group home system out in Ontario for young offenders. And realistically, that was 1987 through 1989 into 1990. The same issues that are coming up right now are the exact issues that I had with the system 20, 25 years ago. And realistically, what we're finding, I think, is that it's just a static model. It doesn't evolve, but it can't evolve unless the community itself plays the bottom-up role. And ultimately, that's where the systems comes into play, and it becomes the most efficient model. And it's been proven not only, internationally. Lethbridge has adopted that model at this point. I can see the, the germination of it here. Obviously, there's more discussion, and Stephen and myself and Karen and all of us wouldn't be sitting in this room right now if we didn't think that there were no improvements needed. So obviously, where I'm coming from at this stage and where you guys are coming from, and that's the big thing. I'm simply interpreting what you folks have told me and what the youth have told me. You guys want the systems model. You just don't know how to affect it at this point in time. Now my job here is done. And like I said, please take it with a grain of salt. It's simply my interpretation of the data. But with that, we'll just leave it at that. So if you got any questions, I'm more than willing to do my best to respond.